Welcome, dear listeners, to Murder at the Paris Opera House, a deadly Miss Marple mystery. This cozy tale, inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, invites you into a world of gentle intrigue, sharp wits, and the comforting charm of village life. Settle in with a cup of tea and let the story unfold. Our adventure begins in the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead during the 1950s, where Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming elderly spinster with an eye for human nature, finds herself entangled in a most puzzling affair. The narration is approximately 80 to 100 minutes in total, perfect for a relaxing evening. And now, without further ado, Chapter 1. The curtain rises. In the gentle embrace of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned as softly as the pages of a well-loved book, autumn had settled over the village like a golden shawl. The hedgerows, thick with the last defiant roses, glowed under the October sun, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves mingling with wood smoke from cottage chimneys. The church bells rang out their familiar Sunday hymn, a melody as comforting as the rhythm of life in this quiet corner of England. It was the 1950s, a time when the world seemed to pause between the scars of war and the rush of modernity, and St. Mary Mead held fast to its timeless charm. At the heart of the village, in a neat cottage with ivy curling around its windows, sat Miss Jane Marple. She was a slight figure, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, her hands rarely idle, often occupied with the soft click of knitting needles. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, fond of her garden and her tea. But those who knew her better understood the sharpness of her mind. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and inquisitive behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Not the flicker of unease in a neighbor's smile, nor the subtle shift in tone at the village shop. She had lived in St. Mary Mead all her life, and in that time she had learned that human nature, with its tangle of virtues and vices. The star of the show was Mrs. Victoria Langford, a widow of considerable wealth and even greater presence. In her late 50s, with a mane of auburn hair only slightly touched by gray, Victoria had the bearing of a duchess and a soprano voice that, while no longer in its prime, could still command a room. She had returned to St. Mary Mead some years ago after a glittering youth as a chorus girl in London, followed by a marriage to a prosperous merchant. Now, widowed and wealthy, she presided over village affairs with a benevolence that bordered on imperiousness. Her role as the lead in the production, a medley of arias inspired by the Phantom of the Opera, was in her mind only fitting. Miss Marple had been invited to the opening night by her nephew, Raymond West, a writer of some repute who visited St. Mary Mead when London grew too hectic. "Aunt Jane," he had said over tea, his eyes twinkling, "you must come. It's a spectacle, even if half the cast forgets their lines." Miss Marple, who enjoyed the theater less for its art than for its display of human foibles, agreed. She arrived at the village hall promptly at 7, dressed in her best tweed coat and a brooch shaped like a tiny bird. The hall was alive with the hum of anticipation. Villagers in their Sunday finest filled the rows of creaking chairs, their whispers mingling with the scent of lavender polish and the faint mustiness of old hymnals. Miss Marple took her seat in the third row, beside Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her old friend from the vicarage. Dolly, a cheerful woman with a penchant for gossip, leaned close. "Isn't it grand, Jane? Like something out of a novel. Though I dare say Victoria Langford thinks she's the only star on stage." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly in her lap as she observed the crowd. There was young Eliza Thorne, the understudy, sitting stiffly with a program clutched in her hands. Mr. Reginald Poole, the director, fussing with his tie and barking orders at a stagehand. And Arthur Langford, Victoria's nephew, slouching in a corner with a sulky expression. The lights dimmed, and a second act, and returned looking flushed. These were the threads, Miss Marple knew, that often wove the tapestry of trouble. The finale approached, a grand scene in which Victoria's character, a doomed diva, raised a prop chalice in a toast to love and tragedy. The chalice, a gleaming silver goblet borrowed from the vicarage, glinted under the makeshift chandelier. Victoria lifted it high, her voice reaching a triumphant crescendo. "To love," she sang, pressing the chalice to her lips. The audience held its breath, caught in the drama. Then, without warning, Victoria faltered. Her hand trembled, the chalice slipping slightly. Her voice broke mid-note, and a gasp escaped her lips. She clutched her throat, her eyes wide with shock, and collapsed in a heap of crimson silk. The music stopped abruptly, the pianist's hands frozen above the keys. For a moment silence gripped the hall, as if the audience believed this was part of the performance. Then a woman screamed and chaos erupted. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was in the front row and leapt to the stage with surprising agility for a man of his years. He knelt beside Victoria, his fingers searching for a pulse. The audience surged forward, voices rising in a cacophony of concern and confusion. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting paused, her eyes scanning the scene. She noted the stagehands frozen in the wings, the cast members huddling together, and young Arthur, who had reappeared at the back of the hall, his face pale. Dr. Haydock stood, his expression grim, and signaled to Mr. Thomas Greer, the stage manager, to fetch the constable. The curtains were hastily drawn, but not before Miss Marple caught sight of the chalice, now lying on its side, a dark stain spreading across the stage floor. The doctor's low voice carried to her ears as he spoke to the vicar who had joined him. "Poison," he said. "Cyanide, I'd wager. Quick and odorless." She was gone in moments. Constable Barnes unraveled the threads of a mystery as intricate as her knitting. For now, though, she walked home. The crunch of leaves underfoot, a reminder that even in the coziest of villages, darkness could fall as swiftly as a curtain. Chapter 2. Whispers Behind the Scenes. The morning after the tragedy at the village hall dawned, bright and crisp in St. Mary Mead. The kind of autumn day that invited long walks and cheerful chatter over garden fences. Yet an undercurrent of unease rippled through the village, as if the golden sunlight could not quite dispel the shadow of the previous night's events. The news of Mrs. Victoria Langford's dramatic collapse during the amateur opera production had spread like wildfire, and by breakfast, every household from the vicarage to the butcher's shop was abuzz with speculation. In her cozy cottage on the high street, Miss Jane Marple sat at her small dining table, a cup of Earl Grey steaming gently before her. Her knitting lay folded neatly in a basket, but her hands were still, her mind as active as the sparrows chattering outside her window. "Such a dreadful thing, Dolly," Miss Marple remarked to her maid, a rosy-cheeked young woman who was bustling about with a tray of scones. Mrs. Langford was not, perhaps, universally loved. But to meet such an end, on stage no less, well, it's quite extraordinary. Dolly, whose penchant for village gossip rivaled even Mrs. Price Ridley's, nodded vigorously. "They're saying it was poison, miss. Cyanide," Dr. Haydock told the constable. "Imagine that, in our village hall. And her with that fancy chalice in her hand. I heard Mr. Poole, the director, was in a right state, shouting about his production being ruined." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Mr. Poole does have a flair for the dramatic," she said, sipping her tea. "But I suspect there are deeper currents at play. Human nature, Dolly, is much the same whether in a grand opera house or our humble village hall. Jealousy, ambition, resentment. These are the threads that weave such tragedies. In varied emotions." Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the window where she could observe without drawing attention. Her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, a comforting sound that seemed to steady the room's nervous energy. Inspector Slack, the gruff policeman from Much Benham, was already present, his notebook open and his pen poised. He was a man of action, impatient with subtleties, and his presence added a certain tension to the room. "Right," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'll need statements from everyone involved in the production. No one leaves until we've sorted this mess." The first to speak was Eliza Thorne, the young understudy whose delicate features were pinched with anxiety. She sat on the edge of a chintz-covered chair, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Langford was, well, she was demanding, always correcting my posture or my phrasing. I only wanted a chance to shine, just once." Her eyes darted to the others, as if seeking reassurance, but found none. Miss Marple noted the girl's flush, the way her fingers shredded the handkerchief's lace. Eliza was barely 20, with the eager ambition of youth. But there was something else, a flicker of resentment, perhaps, or fear. "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured to herself, though her expression remained serene. "Ambition can be a dangerous thing when it festers." Next was Mr. Reginald Poole, the director, a man in his 40s with a waxed mustache and an air of self-importance that seemed undimmed by the tragedy. He paced before the fireplace, his hands gesturing theatrically. "This is a disaster for my reputation," he declared, ignoring Inspector Slack's scowl. "Victoria and I had our differences, of course. Who doesn't in the theater? We argued about the blocking for the final scene, yes, but murder? Preposterous. I'm a man of art, not violence." Inspector Slack raised an eyebrow. "Differences, you say? Care to elaborate, Mr. Poole?" "Reginald, of myself. Cut my funds a bit." He shrugged, but his fingers drummed nervously on his knee. "And where were you during the performance?" Inspector Slack pressed. "Out for a smoke," Arthur replied quickly. "Needed some air. The hall was stuffy." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Arthur's absence during the second act had not gone unnoticed, nor had his flushed return. Debt, she mused, could make a man desperate, especially one with a taste for cards, as the village whispers suggested. Mrs. Beatrice Croft, a stout matron with a penchant for floral hats, was not officially part of the production, but had been a prominent member of the choral society and Victoria's longtime rival. She sat primly, her lips pursed. "Victoria and I had our disagreements," she admitted when prompted. "She stole my solo at last year's Christmas concert, but I'd never stooped to, well, you know." Her denial was emphatic, almost too much so, and Miss Marple noted the way her hands clutched her teacup, as if anchoring herself against the accusation. Lastly, there was Mr. Thomas Greer, the stage manager, a quiet man in his 30s with ink-stained fingers from his day job as an accountant. He spoke little, his voice steady but soft. Mrs. Langford was particular about the props. He said, "She wanted the chalice polished just so. I handled it before the show, as did others. It was on the prop table all day." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Inspector Slack asked. Thomas shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary, though." He hesitated, then added, "She did ask for the wine to be poured fresh before the final act. Said it looked cloudy." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. The wine, of course, was grape juice, but its preparation was a detail worth noting. Who had poured it, and when? As the interviews continued, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from one face to another. The vicarage drawing room, with its faded wallpaper and scent of lavender, was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead. Warm, familiar, yet now tinged with suspicion. She observed the small gestures. Mead, with its cozy cottages and friendly faces, but beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the morning's revelations. The chalice, the poison, the motives, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. She thought of her garden at home, where foxgloves bloomed in the summer, their beauty hiding a deadly secret. Not cyanide, of course, but poison all the same. "Nature," she murmured to herself, "has much to teach us about deception." As she walked back to her cottage, the church bells rang out noon, a reminder of the village's enduring rhythm. But for Miss Marple, the real work was just beginning. The stage was set, the players introduced, and the mystery of Victoria Langford's death was a drama she intended to unravel, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 3. Shadows of Motive. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green where children played and neighbors lingered to exchange hushed theories about the tragedy at the village hall. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and the gentle rhythm of life in this quiet corner of 1950s England seemed, for a moment, to pause under the weight of suspicion. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles idle in her lap as she gazed out at the high street. The events of the previous night and the morning's gathering at the vicarage had set her mind turning, like a spindle gathering threads of possibility. "It's the little things," she murmured to herself. "The glances, the hesitations, that tell the story." The village hall, now cordoned off with a constable stationed at its doors, stood silent, its makeshift Paris Opera House sign swaying slightly in the breeze. Miss Marple decided a visit was in order. She donned her tweed coat, pinned her hat with its tiny bird brooch, and set out, her steps measured but purposeful. The hall was a short walk past the post office and the bakery, where the scent was dim. The velvet curtains drawn and the crystal bead chandelier catching stray shafts of light. The stage was as it had been left. The prop table cluttered with goblets, candelabras, and a tattered script. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the silver chalice, now sealed in a bag by Inspector Slack's orders. Dr. Haydock had confirmed cyanide, quick, odorless, and deadly, laced into the grape juice Victoria Langford drank during her final toast. The chalice had been handled by many, Thomas Greer had said, but who had the opportunity to tamper with it? Miss Marple lingered near the table, her gaze drifting to the wings where stagehands had bustled during the performance. A scrap of fabric caught her eye, a torn bit of lace snagged on a nail. It was delicate, like the handkerchief Eliza Thorne had shredded at the vicarage. Filing this away, Miss Marple stepped back as Inspector Slack emerged from the back room, his notebook bristling with scribbles. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and grudging respect. "Meddling again, are you?" "Merely observing, Inspector," she replied, her smile disarming. "The stage is a fascinating place, don't you think? So many hands, so many secrets." Slack grunted and moved on, but Miss Marple's mind was already weaving connections. The chalice, the lace, the grape juice, each a thread in a tapestry yet to be fully revealed. Her next stop was the home of Mrs. Beatrice Croft, the Choral Society matron, whose rivalry with Victoria was the stuff of village legend. Beatrice's cottage, a sturdy affair with a garden bursting with late dahlias, was a short walk across the green. Miss Marple knocked, and Beatrice answered, her floral hat slightly askew and her face flushed. "Oh, Jane, come in, do. Such a dreadful business." Over tea and scones in Beatrice's cluttered parlor, the conversation turned to the opera. "Victoria was always the star," Beatrice said, her voice tight. "Last year at the Christmas concert, she insisted on some to Mr. Greer last month for the hall's rat problem. Signed for it himself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "And was it used?" Mr. Hodges frowned. "Can't say. You'd have to ask Thomas. But it's locked up proper, mind you." Thomas Greer, the stage manager, lived in a modest flat above the village bookshop. Miss Marple found him there, surrounded by ledgers and scripts, his ink-stained fingers sorting papers. He was a quiet man, his eyes thoughtful behind wire-rimmed glasses. "The cyanide?" he said when Miss Marple broached the subject. "I bought it for the hall, yes, but it was stolen from the storage cupboard a week ago. I reported it to Constable Barnes, but he said it was likely a prank." Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought along, clicked softly. "Stolen," she repeated. "How curious. And the chalice? Did you prepare the grape juice yourself?" "I poured it," Thomas admitted. "But others were around. Eliza, Reginald, even Arthur. The prop table was a busy place before the show." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning to Arthur Langford. The young man was often seen at the Black Bull, the village pub, where whispers of his gambling debts had reached even her ears. She decided to visit the pub, ostensibly to deliver a knitting pattern to the barmaid, Nellie, who was a distant cousin of Dolly's. The Black Bull was lively that evening, with farmers and shopkeepers sharing pints and theories. Nellie, wiping down the bar, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Terrible about Mrs. Langford," she said, leaning close. "Young Arthur was in here last week, looking proper worried. Said his auntie had cut him off, and he owed money to some rough types in Much Benham." "Did he now?" Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And was he here during the performance?" Nellie shook her head. "Not that I saw. He came in aftermind, looking like he'd seen a ghost." As Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into twilight, she pieced together her observations. Eliza's lace, Beatrice's paint-stained sleeve, Thomas's stolen cyanide, Arthur's debts, Beatrice with her resentment, Thomas with his quiet precision, Arthur with his desperation. We're all players in a drama far darker than the opera. As the church bells chimed evening, Miss Marple smiled to herself. The shadows of motive were lengthening, but she knew that light, however faint, would eventually reveal them. Chapter 4. The False Note. The autumn days in St. Mary Mead grew shorter, the golden light of October filtering through the trees with a melancholy glow. The village, though still wrapped in its cozy routines, morning deliveries from the bakery, the postman's cheerful whistle, the soft chatter over garden fences, carried a new weight of suspicion. The tragedy at the village hall, where Mrs. Victoria Langford had collapsed in a dramatic flourish of poison, lingered like a stubborn mist. Miss Jane Marple, in her cottage on the high street, sat by her hearth, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The firelight danced across her spectacles, and her mind sifted through the threads of the mystery. The chalice, the cyanide, the motives simmering beneath the village's placid surface. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple decided to attend the weekly church fete, held on the green despite the somber mood. The fete was a St. Mary Mead tradition, with stalls of homemade jams, knitted scarves, and a tombola presided over by Mrs. Clement. Miss Marple, in her tweed coat and bird-shaped brooch, strolled among the crowd, her eyes bright with observation. The village was determined to carry on, as if the bustle of normalcy could banish the shadow of murder. Yet whispers followed her, snatches of gossip as pungent as the cider simmering on a nearby stall. "Arthur Langford's in a right mess," a farmer muttered to his wife, unaware of Miss Marple's proximity. "Heard he was seen near the props before the show, sneaking about like a fox." Miss Marple's needles paused in her bag. Arthur, Victoria's nephew, had been evasive at the vicarage, his alibi of a solitary walk during the performance as flimsy as tissue paper. Inspector Slack, with his bulldog tenacity, "Didn't touch the chalice, I swear." Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, noted the sweat beading on Arthur's brow. His story was plausible, but his eyes darted to the exit, betraying nerves beyond mere innocence. Slack, sensing weakness, pressed harder. "Your debts are no secret, lad. Owe money to half the bookies in Much Benham, don't you? Killing your aunt would have cleared your slate with that inheritance." "I didn't," Arthur protested, his voice cracking. "I was out for a smoke, like I said." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Arthur's desperation was palpable, but something in his panic felt too raw, too uncalculated for a murderer's cunning. She stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Inspector, might I have a word with young Arthur? A small matter about the fete." Slack scowled but waved her on, muttering about meddling spinsters. Miss Marple sat beside Arthur, her demeanor as soothing as chamomile tea. "Tell me, dear," she said, "what did you see when you were near the props? Even the smallest detail might help." Arthur swallowed, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I saw Eliza there, fussing with her costume, and Mr. Poole was shouting about something, waving his flask around. That's all, Miss Marple, honest." She nodded, filing away the mention of Reginald Poole's flask. Brandy, he called it, medicinal for his nerves. As she left the hall, she caught sight of a small object glinting in the corner. A button, brass and embossed with a theatrical mask, likely from a costume. She left it for the constable, but noted its presence. Details, she knew, were the stitches that held a mystery together. Her next stop was the village green, where the fete was in full swing. The air was filled with laughter and the clink of teacups, But Miss Marple's ears caught a different note. Mrs. Beatrice Croft holding court near the cake stall, her voice carrying over the crowd. Didn't want her dead. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but she noted the tremor in Eliza's voice, the way her fingers clutched the drum's handle. Ambition was a powerful motive, especially in one so young and eager. "Of course, dear," she said. "Did you happen to notice the chalice before the show? Perhaps when you were adjusting your costume?" Eliza shook her head quickly. "I was too busy. Mr. Greer poured the juice, I think. Or maybe Mr. Poole. It was all such a rush." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind turning to Thomas Greer. The stage manager's quiet demeanor and ink-stained fingers suggested a man of precision. Yet his report of stolen cyanide was troublingly convenient. She decided to visit the village hall's storage cupboard, where the poison had been kept. With Constable Barnes's grudging permission, she examined the lock, a simple latch easily forced. The cupboard held paint cans, ropes, and a dusty box labeled "Rat Control," now empty. A faint scent lingered, chemical and sharp, though not cyanide's almond-like trace. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Someone had been here, but who? As she left the hall, she encountered Reginald Poole striding across the green with his usual theatrical flair. "Miss Marple," he called, his mustache twitching. "A word, if you please. This nonsense about me and Victoria, utter rubbish. Beatrice Croft's stirring the pot as always." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Mrs. Croft did mention a certain closeness between you and Mrs. Langford." Reginald's face reddened. "Closeness? Ha! Victoria was a star, I'll grant you, but my interest was purely artistic. She had a habit of upstaging everyone, mind you, drove me mad." He patted his pocket where the outline of his flask was visible. "Needed a nip or two to get through rehearsals, I'll admit." Miss Marple smiled, noting the flask's prominence. "And the chalice, Mr. Poole. Did you handle it before the performance?" "Me? No, that was Thomas's," eyes twinkling. "And in that game, the truth is often the quietest player." The village settled into evening, the church bells chiming softly. Miss Marple's mind was a garden of possibilities, each clue a seed waiting to sprout. The false note, Arthur's arrest, Beatrice's gossip, the missing cyanide was loud. But she knew the real melody lay beneath, in the subtle discord of human nature. As she knitted, she thought of the chalice gleaming under the chandelier, and the hands that had touched it. The stage was set, and the next act was coming. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. The autumn light in St. Mary Mead had softened to a delicate glow, painting the village in hues of amber and russet. The leaves on the elms along the high street fluttered down like golden confetti, and the air carried the faint tang of bonfires from distant gardens. Yet the warmth of the season could not dispel the chill that had settled over the village since Mrs. Victoria Langford's tragic end at the village hall, now known to all as the ill-fated Paris Opera House. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage's cozy parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly, pondered the threads of the mystery. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows, and her mind wove through the clues. The poisoned chalice, the torn lace, the stolen cyanide, and the tangle of motives among the suspects. The village was abuzz with Inspector Slack's latest move. Arthur Langford, Victoria's nephew, had been detained for further questioning, his shaky alibi and gambling debts making him the prime suspect. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. "Suspicion is like a net," she murmured to her maid Dolly, who was dusting the mantelpiece. "It catches the obvious fish, but the clever ones slip through." Dolly, ever eager for intrigue, paused with her cloth. "Do you think Arthur's innocent, miss? Everyone's saying he did it for the money." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Everyone says many things, Dolly, but it's what they don't say that matters." Determined to dig deeper. Review. Listing Victoria as a supporting act. Opposite her name was another, Clara Thorne, a soprano who had vanished from the stage after a public feud. "Clara Thorne?" Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Any relation to young Eliza, perhaps?" Miss Hartnell's brow furrowed. "Now you mention it, Eliza's mother was a singer, wasn't she? Passed away some years back. I never made the connection." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind racing. Eliza Thorne, the nervous understudy, might carry a legacy of resentment. A mother's disgrace could fuel a daughter's ambition or revenge. She resolved to speak with Eliza, but first she visited the vicarage where Mrs. Clement was hosting a knitting circle, a perfect opportunity to observe the village's pulse. The vicarage parlor was a haven of warmth, with a tray of scones and a pot of tea steaming on the table. Beatrice Croft was there, her floral hat bobbing as she recounted the latest gossip. "They found something in Victoria's dressing room," she said, her voice low but eager. "A poisoned sweet, wrapped in gold foil. Inspector Slack thinks it was meant for her, but she never ate it." Miss Marple's needles paused. A poisoned sweet was a dramatic touch, almost too perfect. "How curious," she said. "And where is this sweet now?" "Locked up with the police," Beatrice replied, her eyes narrowing. "But it proves someone was out to get her, doesn't it?" The other women nodded, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. A sweet seemed a clumsy method compared to the chalice's cyanide, more likely a distraction than a genuine attempt. She excused herself and sought out Eliza, who was lingering near the garden gate, her face pale. "Eliza, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a lullaby. "I was just recalling your mother's time on the stage. She was a singer, wasn't she? Like Mrs. Langford." Eliza's eyes widened, then dropped to the ground. "Yes, Miss Marple. Mother was talented." The lighting with his usual calm. His ledger, always at hand, caught her eye. A meticulous record of props and schedules. "Mr. Greer," she called softly, beckoning him over. "I understand the cyanide was stolen from your cupboard. Have you recalled anything more about that?" Thomas's face remained impassive. "Nothing new, Miss Marple. The lock was forced and the box was gone. I thought it odd, but with rehearsals I didn't pursue it." "And the chalice is grape juice?" she asked. "You poured it, I believe." "I did," he admitted. "But it was a fresh bottle, opened that day. I left it on the table for a moment while I fixed a light." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the window of opportunity. As she left the hall, she spotted Inspector Slack outside, his face grim. "We've arrested Reginald Poole," he announced. "His fingerprints were on the chalice, and that flask of his. Brandy, he says, but we're testing it. Plus, there's talk of an affair with Victoria gone sour." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "An affair, Inspector? That sounds like Mrs. Croft's handiwork." Slack shrugged. "Gossip or not, his prints are real. And he had access to the props. As Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into dusk, she considered the new developments. The poison sweet was a red herring, she was certain. Too theatrical, too obvious. Reginald's arrest, based on fingerprints and gossip, felt equally misguided. The chalice had been handled by many, and an affair seemed more Beatrice's invention than fact. Yet the past, Victoria's history with Clara Thorne, Thomas's stolen cyanide, Arthur's debts, echoed in her mind like a half-remembered tune. At her cottage, Dolly greeted her with a fresh pot of tea. "They're saying Mr. Poole did it now, miss," she said, her eyes wide. "Fancy that. A director turning murderer." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Fancy, indeed. But the stage is full of illusions, Dolly. The truth is often backstage, in the shadows." She settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Life. Teacups clinking in parlors. The postman's whistle. The laughter of children on the green was overlaid with a quiet tension. The murder of Mrs. Victoria Langford during the amateur opera production at the village hall had cast a shadow, and the village hall, its makeshift chandelier now dark, stood as a silent reminder of the tragedy. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with a soft, steady click. The firelight flickered across her spectacles, and her mind wove through the clues. The poisoned chalice, the stolen cyanide, the torn lace, the brass button, and the web of motives spun by ambition, resentment, and greed. The village buzzed with the latest development. Reginald Poole, the pompous director, had been released from custody. Inspector Slack, though reluctant, had admitted the evidence. Fingerprints on the chalice and gossip of an affair was too flimsy to hold him. Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea, had anticipated this. "Fingerprints are like footprints in a crowded room," she remarked to Dolly, her maid, who was polishing the silver teapot. "They tell you someone was there, but not what they did." Dolly's eyes widened. "So you think Mr. Poole's innocent, miss? Everyone's saying he was sweet on Mrs. Langford." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Everyone says many things, Dolly. But it's the quiet details that sing the truth." Determined to unravel those details, Miss Marple attended the resumed rehearsals at the village hall. The cast, though shaken, had rallied under Reginald's insistence that the show must go on. The hall was a flurry of activity. Stagehands adjusted lights, the pianist practiced scales, and Eliza Thorne, now promoted to Victoria's role, moved tentatively through her blocking. Miss Marple took a seat in the back, her knitting a discreet companion, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Reginald strutted across the stage, his mustache quivering as he directed with renewed vigor. "Eliza, darling, more passion. You're the diva now," he called, his voice echoing, though cyanide was the poison in question. As the rehearsal broke for tea, Miss Marple approached Thomas Greer, who was checking the prop table. "Mr. Greer," she said, her voice gentle, "you've been so diligent with the production. I wonder, did you notice anything unusual about the grape juice bottle before the performance? You said it was fresh, but perhaps it was tampered with earlier." Thomas's ink-stained fingers paused on his ledger. "I opened it myself, Miss Marple, just before the final act. It was sealed, no tampering that I could see. But I left it on the table for a few minutes while I fixed a curtain." He hesitated, then added, "Arthur was nearby, and Eliza. Even Mr. Poole came by, fussing about the lighting." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the timeline. The prop table, a hub of activity, was a perfect stage for sleight of hand. She thanked Thomas and moved to the wings, where a stack of old programs caught her eye. One, slightly crumpled, bore a faint pencil mark. Act 3, Chalice Scene, 8:45. The handwriting was precise, like Thomas's ledger entries, but it could belong to anyone. She slipped the program into her bag for later study. Her next stop was the village post office, where a new clue had surfaced. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, had found a torn ticket stub in Victoria's purse, which had been left in the dressing room and collected by the police. The stub was from a London theater, a performance of Carmen 2 weeks prior. "Odd, isn't it?" Mrs. Weatherby said, handing Miss Marple a cup of tea. Mrs. Langford wasn't one for London trips lately, and the stub was crumpled, like she meant to throw it away. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Very odd indeed. Did she mention meeting anyone there?" "Not a word," Mrs. Weatherby replied. "But she came back in a mood, all snappish. I heard her tell Mr. Poole the trip was a waste of time." This piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. A London trip, a secret meeting, a mood. Small threads, but Covent Garden. But found nothing, no record of Victoria's companion, no clear motive. Another false lead, perhaps, but Miss Marple sensed. It was a piece of the puzzle, misplaced but not irrelevant. Back at the village hall, she observed the final moments of rehearsal. Eliza faltered on a high note, and Reginald's shout of "Again!" made her flinch. Beatrice, in the audience, smirked, her satisfaction evident. Thomas adjusted a spotlight, his movements precise, while Arthur, who had slipped in late, hovered near the exit, his eyes darting. The village's warmth, neighbors sharing tea, the pianist's cheerful tune, clashed with the undercurrent of suspicion, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the dimming lights, both literal and metaphorical. At home, over a late tea, Dolly burst in with news. "They're saying Mr. Poole's flask had something funny in it, miss. Not brandy, but some chemical. Inspector Slack's testing it now." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A chemical, you say? How interesting." She recalled Reginald's flask, always at hand during rehearsals. Could it have held cyanide? Yet his flamboyance seemed ill-suited to such a subtle crime. Another distraction, perhaps, like the poison sweet. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a soft rhythm. The village was a stage, its players caught in a drama of their own making. Eliza's ambition, Beatrice's resentment, Thomas's precision, Arthur's debts, Reginald's pride, each was a note in a discordant melody. The ticket stub, the program's pencil mark, the flask, they were clues, but some were false, designed to mislead. "It's like a garden," she murmured, "where weeds mimic flowers to survive." She thought of the chalice, its deadly contents poured under the glare of the chandelier. Who had the opportunity, the knowledge, the nerve? The lights were dimming, but Miss Marple knew that truth, like a star in the twilight, would soon shine through. She picked up her knitting, her mind as torn lace, the brass button, the stolen cyanide, the crumpled ticket stub, and the web of motives woven by the suspects. The village was abuzz with the latest developments. Reginald Poole's release had shifted suspicion, and Inspector Slack, frustrated by the lack of solid evidence, had turned his attention back to Arthur Langford, whose gambling debts and weak alibi made him a persistent target. Miss Marple, however, sensed that the truth lay deeper, hidden in the subtle patterns of human behavior. "It's like a tapestry, Dolly," she remarked to her maid, who was setting out a tray of tea and biscuits. "The bold colors catch the eye, but the finer threads hold the design together." Dolly, her eyes bright with curiosity, leaned forward. "Do you think Arthur's guilty, miss? Or is it that Mr. Poole with his fancy flask?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Guilt, Dolly, is often a quiet thing, hidden in plain sight. We must look closer." Her morning began in her garden, where the last of the roses clung stubbornly to their stems. As she pruned a bush, her eyes fell on a cluster of foxgloves, their bell-shaped flowers a reminder of nature's dual beauty and danger. Though foxgloves yielded digitalis, not cyanide, the sight sparked a thought. Poison required knowledge, and knowledge required intent. She recalled Eliza Thorne's garden, lush with herbs and flowers, and Beatrice Croft's dahlia beds, where a keen gardener might conceal more than blooms. With this in mind, Miss Marple decided to revisit the village chemist, Mr. Hodges, to confirm the details of the cyanide purchase. Mr. Hodges, a meticulous man with a penchant for order, greeted her warmly. "Back again, Miss Marple. Still curious about that rat poison?" "Merely tying up loose ends," she replied, her tone mild. "Suppose Reginald had no choice." She paused, then added, "I saw him tampering with the props before the show, you know. Fiddling with that chalice. Suspicious, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind sharpened. Beatrice's accusation was pointed, almost rehearsed. "Indeed," she said. "And where were you at the time?" "Oh, adjusting my costume in the wings," Beatrice replied quickly. "I had a small part, you see, just a chorus role." Her hands fidgeted, and Miss Marple noticed a faint stain on her gardening gloves. Not soil, but a smudge of red. Stage paint, perhaps, from the prop table. Thanking Beatrice, Miss Marple left, her mind buzzing. The paint stain was a small clue, but significant. The prop table had been a hub of activity, and Beatrice's presence there, however minor, placed her near the chalice. Miss Marple's next stop was the village hall, where rehearsals continued despite the pall of suspicion. The cast moved through their scenes with forced cheer, and Eliza, now in the lead role, sang with a tremor in her voice. Miss Marple took her usual seat in the back, her knitting a quiet companion. During a break, she approached Eliza, who was sipping water nervously. "You're doing splendidly, dear," Miss Marple said. "It must be daunting, stepping into such a role." Eliza's smile was strained. "I'm trying, Miss Marple, but everyone's watching, judging. And after what happened, it's hard to focus." "Did you notice anything odd before the performance?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Perhaps around the prop table." Eliza hesitated, her eyes flickering. "It was chaotic. Mr. Greer was pouring the juice, Mr. Poole was shouting, and Arthur was, well, lurking. I saw Mrs. Croft there too, adjusting a candelabra. She seemed annoyed." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Beatrice's presence at the prop table was confirmed, and her annoyance suggested more than a passing interest. As she left the hall, Miss Marple spotted a discarded program near the stage, its pages marked with the same precise handwriting she'd seen before. Chalice scene, 8:45. Check props. The script findings. Beatrice's paint-stained gloves and interest in poisons were damning, but her accusation against Reginald felt like a deliberate deflection. Eliza's nervousness and her mother's history with Victoria suggested a motive, but her fear seemed genuine. Thomas's stolen cyanide and precise handwriting were troubling, yet his calm demeanor was almost too perfect. Arthur's debts and mysterious benefactor hinted at hidden dealings, but his panic lacked a murderer's calculation. At her cottage, Dolly greeted her with a fresh pot of tea. "Any closer to solving it, miss?" she asked, her eyes bright. "Closer, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, settling into her armchair. "But it's like knitting a complex pattern. One wrong stitch and the whole design unravels." She picked up her needles, the familiar rhythm soothing her thoughts. The village was a stage, its players caught in a web of secrets. The paint stain, the program's handwriting, the sudden payment of Arthur's debts, these were glimmers of truth, piercing the dimming lights of deception. Miss Marple thought of the chalice. Its deadly contents poured under the chandelier's glow, and the hands that had touched it. The truth was near, she sensed, like a melody waiting to be heard. As the church bells chimed evening, she smiled to herself, ready for the next act. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Stage. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a crisp October sky, its rooftops dusted with the first hints of frost as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the green. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the gentle rhythm of village life, teacups clinking in parlors, the postman's whistle, the chatter of neighbors, carried on despite the dark cloud of Mrs. Victoria Langford's murder at the village hall's Paris Opera House production. In her cozy cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing click. The firelight flickered across her spectacles, and her mind wove through the intricate threads of the mystery. The poisoned chalice, the torn lace, the brass button. Gardner can spot them. Dolly's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Have you spotted the weed, miss? Everyone's betting on Arthur or Mr. Poole." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Bets are for card games, Dolly. Mysteries require patience." To test her growing suspicions, Miss Marple decided to host a small tea at her cottage, inviting the key players in the drama: Eliza Thorne, Reginald Poole, Beatrice Croft, Thomas Greer, and Arthur Langford. The invitation was framed as a gesture of village hospitality, a chance to ease the tension of the investigation. But Miss Marple had a sharper purpose. "People reveal themselves when they're comfortable," she mused, arranging a tray of her best china and a plate of Dolly's lemon biscuits. The gathering began at 4 o'clock, the cottage parlor aglow with lamplight and the scent of Earl Grey. Eliza arrived first, her delicate features pinched with nerves, her hands twisting a scarf. "Thank you for inviting me, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft. "It's been difficult with everyone watching me." "You're doing wonderfully in the role, dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm. "It must be a challenge, stepping into such a spotlight." Eliza nodded, her eyes flickering. "Mrs. Langford was so commanding. I'm trying, but it's hard to measure up." Reginald Poole swept in next, his mustache impeccably waxed, his voice booming. "A charming respite, Miss Marple. This village needs a touch of civility after all this nonsense." He launched into a monologue about the production's revival, his hands gesturing theatrically. Miss Marple noted his flask tucked in his pocket and the way he avoided mentioning Victoria directly. Beatrice Croft arrived in a flurry of floral fabric, her hat adorned with a new ribbon. "Such a kind gesture, Jane," she said, her smile tight. "Though I dare say some people don't deserve such niceties." Her glance at Reginald was pointed, and Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of her earlier gossip snorted softly. "Guidance. She ran the show and you know it. Always stealing the spotlight." Her voice dripped with resentment, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around her teacup. Eliza, sipping her tea, spoke little, but her eyes darted between Reginald and Beatrice as if weighing their words. Thomas remained silent, his notebook open, jotting occasional notes. Arthur fidgeted, spilling a drop of tea on his knee, his discomfort palpable. Miss Marple steered the conversation to the night of the murder. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice light, "how busy the prop table was before the final act. So many hands, so much bustle. Did any of you notice the chalice's preparation?" Thomas spoke first. "I poured the grape juice as I said, fresh bottle sealed. But I stepped away to fix a light. Anyone could have touched it." "Anyone indeed," Beatrice said sharply. "I saw Reginald near the table adjusting props. He was awfully close to that chalice." Reginald's mustache twitched. "Nonsense. I was checking the candelabra's placement. You were there yourself, Beatrice, fussing with your costume." Beatrice flushed. "I was in the chorus. I had to adjust my sash." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes moving from one to another. The accusations were familiar, but the tension in the room was new, as if the truth were a taut string waiting to snap. She changed tack. "Mr. Greer, your ledger is so meticulous. Did you note the timing of the chalice's preparation?" Thomas blinked, surprised. Yes, I marked it at 8:40, just before the final act. The juice was poured, then left on the table." "And you, Eliza?" Miss Marple asked. "You were nearby, weren't you?" Eliza nodded, her voice small. "I was fixing my hair. I didn't touch the chalice, though." Arthur, silent until now, blurted, "I wasn't anywhere near it. I was outside, like I said." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. As the tea concluded, Miss Marple's mind was alight with a crucial discovery. She had recalled a detail from the found, its precise handwriting, chalice scene, 8:45, check props, matching samples she'd seen in Beatrice's cottage, where she'd helped with the Choral Society's schedules. The paint stain on Beatrice's gloves, the vial, the handwriting. These were threads converging on a single figure. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, as her maid cleared the tea tray, "what do you make of someone who knows too much about another's habits?" Dolly grinned. "Sounds like they're up to no good, miss. Watching too close, maybe." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. The stage was narrowing, the suspect's roles clearer. Beatrice's resentment, masked by gossip, was a motive as old as time. Eliza's ambition, Thomas's precision, Arthur's debts, Reginald's pride. They were players, but Beatrice was the director of this tragedy. The truth was emerging, like a flower breaking through frost, and Miss Marple was ready for the final act. Chapter 9. The Final Aria. The village of St. Mary Mead lay cloaked in the hush of an October evening, its cottages glowing softly under the fading light, their chimneys trailing wisps of smoke into the crisp air. The church bells had fallen silent, and the green strewn with fallen leaves seemed to hold its breath as if anticipating a revelation. The murder of Mrs. Victoria Langford at the Village Hall's Paris Opera House production had woven a thread of unease through the cozy fabric of village life, and the weight of suspicion hung heavy. In her cottage on the high street, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles still, her mind as sharp as the glint of her spectacles. The clues, the poisoned chalice, the torn lace, the brass button, the stolen cyanide, the crumpled ticket stub, the paint-stained gloves, the sugared vial, and the precise handwriting on the program had coalesced into a pattern as clear as the stitches in her latest shawl. Tonight she would bring the curtain down on the mystery. Miss Marple had arranged a gathering at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the resumption of the theatrical production. Believe we can bring light to it tonight. Murder, you see, is not a grand gesture but a series of small ones, woven together by human nature. Inspector Slack shifted impatiently, but the others leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. Eliza clutched her scarf, her delicate features pale. Reginald adjusted his mustache, his bravado muted. Beatrice's floral hat bobbed slightly, her lips tight. Thomas sat with his ledger closed, his expression calm but watchful. Arthur slouched, his hands fidgeting. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The chalice, laced with cyanide, was the instrument of death. But the real question is who had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the motive to place it there. Let us begin with the chalice's preparation. Mr. Greer, you poured the grape juice, did you not? Thomas nodded, his voice steady. Yes, Miss Marple. A fresh bottle, opened just before the final act. I left it on the prop table for a moment while I adjusted a light. And in that moment, Miss Marple continued, anyone could have tampered with it. Eliza, you were nearby, adjusting your costume. Mr. Poole, you were checking props. Arthur, you were seen near the table, though you claim you were outside. And Mrs. Croft, you were in the wings, tending to a candelabra. Beatrice bristled. I was merely helping. The stage was a mess. Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unwavering. Indeed. But let us consider the cyanide. Mr. Greer purchased it for rats, yet it was stolen from the hall's cupboard. A convenient theft, perhaps, to shift suspicion. And then there's the grape juice, sweetened to mask the poison's bitterness. Victoria, as we know, loved sweets, but someone assumed she did not, adding sugar to ensure she drank without hesitation. Eliza's eyes widened, and Arthur shifted uncomfortably. Reginald cleared his throat. Preposterous. I had no reason to harm her. She was my— Voice calm. Please, Mr. Poole. Mrs. Croft's accusation was clever, but it was a distraction. The paint on her gloves, the vial of syrup, the handwriting, these point to her. But the true motive lies in the past. Victoria, as a young chorus girl, outshone many, including Clara Thorne, Eliza's mother. Yet it was not Eliza who harbored the deepest grudge. She turned to Beatrice again. You and Victoria were rivals long before St. Mary Mead, were you not? In the choral society, she took your solos, your spotlight. Her return to the village, her wealth, her role in the opera, it was too much. You planned carefully, using the stolen cyanide, adding sugar to the chalice during the dress rehearsal switch, knowing Victoria would drink during the toast. The poison sweet was a red herring, planted to confuse. Your gloves, your notes, your knowledge of her habits. They betray you. Beatrice's teacup clattered to the saucer, her face ashen. "You can't prove it," she cried. But her voice cracked, and her eyes darted to the door. Inspector Slack stood, his notebook open. "That's enough, Mrs. Croft. We'll need to search your cottage. Those gloves, that handwriting, it's more than coincidence." The room exhaled, a collective breath of shock and relief. Eliza's hands trembled, tears in her eyes. "I hated her, but I couldn't," she whispered. Arthur slumped, his voice low. "I thought they'd blame me. I was scared." Thomas closed his ledger, his expression unreadable. Reginald sank into his chair, muttering about his ruined production. Miss Marple's voice softened. "Jealousy, Mrs. Croft, is a poison as deadly as cyanide. It festered for years, and when the opportunity came, you acted. But the truth, like a garden, cannot stay hidden." Beatrice broke down, her shoulders shaking. "She took everything," she sobbed. "My solos, my pride, my place in the village. I couldn't bear it anymore. I only meant to make her falter, to—" Morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle glow across the village, where the rooftops shimmered with a delicate frost, and the last autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the elms. The church bells chimed softly, heralding a new day, and the air was fragrant with the scent of wood smoke and freshly baked bread from the bakery. The village, with its cozy cottages and hedge-rowed lanes, seemed to exhale a sigh of relief after the dramatic revelation at the vicarage the previous evening. Mrs. Beatrice Croft's confession to the murder of Mrs. Victoria Langford had lifted the shadow that had hung over the community, restoring its comforting rhythm. In her cottage on the high street, Miss Jane Marple sat at her small dining table, a pot of Earl Grey steaming before her, her knitting needles resting in a basket nearby. The fire crackled in the hearth, and her mind, ever sharp behind her spectacles, reflected on the intricate tapestry of clues that had unraveled the mystery. The poisoned chalice, the torn lace, the brass button, the stolen cyanide, the crumpled ticket stub, the paint-stained gloves, the sugared vial, and the precise handwriting on the program. Dolly, her maid, bustled in with a tray of scones, her eyes bright with excitement. "The whole village is talking, miss," she exclaimed, setting the tray down. "Mrs. Croft, a murderer. Who'd have thought it? And you, sorting it all out like a puzzle." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile as she poured tea. "Puzzles, Dolly, are merely patterns waiting to be seen. People are much the same, you know. Predictable in their unpredictability." Dolly grinned, placing a jar of homemade raspberry jam on the table. "Will you tell us how you did it, miss? I mean, how you knew it was her?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "I suppose a little explanation is in order. Fetch Raymond, would you? He's due for a visit, and he'll want to hear this over a cup of tea." Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, had purchased it for the hall. The ticket stub from Victoria's London trip suggested a secret, and Arthur Langford's debts made him an easy suspect. But these were distractions, some planted, some coincidental. Raymond leaned forward. "But how did you settle on Beatrice, Aunt Jane? She seems so ordinary." Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to underscore her words. "Ordinary people, Raymond, are often the most complex. Beatrice Croft's rivalry with Victoria was no secret. She spoke of it openly, her solos stolen, her pride wounded. But it was deeper than that. Years ago in the Choral Society, and perhaps even before, in London's theaters, Victoria outshone her. Beatrice's resentment grew like a weed, choking her goodwill. When the opera production gave Victoria the starring role, it was the final straw. She paused, spreading jam on a scone. The crucial clue was the handwriting on the program. Chalice scene, 8:45, check props. It matched Beatrice's notes from the Choral Society, which I saw in her cottage. She was meticulous, you see, planning the poison's timing. The paint stain on her gloves placed her at the prop table, where she added cyanide to the grape juice during the dress rehearsal switch, knowing Victoria would drink during the toast. The sugared vial, hidden behind a candelabra, was her touch. She assumed Victoria disliked sweet drinks, a mistake that revealed her intent. Victoria loved sweets, so the sugar was meant to mask the cyanide's bitterness. Dolly gasped. But the poison sweet, miss, wasn't that part of it? Miss Marple shook her head. A clever red herring, Dolly. Beatrice planted it in Victoria's dressing room to confuse the investigation, pointing fingers at others. The sweet was harmless, but it suggested a second attempt, muddying the waters. Her accusations against Reginald, his supposed affair, his flask, were more distractions. Reginald's pride was bruised, but he lacked the subtlety for poison. Eliza's ambition was real, but her fear was genuine. Time. Dolly, wide-eyed, set down her cloth. It's like a story, miss. You saw what nobody else did. Miss Marple's smile was modest. I merely observed, Dolly. People are like my knitting, a dropped stitch here, a tangled thread there. But the pattern emerges if you look closely. Raymond closed his notebook, grinning. You should write these down, Aunt Jane. You'd outsell my novels. Nonsense, she said, though her eyes twinkled. I prefer my garden and my knitting. Besides, the village writes its own stories. As Raymond left, promising to return for supper, Miss Marple stepped into her garden, where the roses still bloomed despite the frost. The village hall, its Paris Opera House sign now removed, stood quietly across the green, its stage empty, but its memory vivid. The production had been abandoned, the cast too shaken to continue, but the village was knitting itself back together. Neighbors shared tea and sympathy, and the church fete's proceeds were donated to repair the hall's roof, a gesture of healing. Miss Marple pruned a rose bush, her movements gentle but precise. She thought of Beatrice, now in custody, her confession a release of years of bitterness. She thought of Victoria, whose brilliance had sparked such envy, and of the others, Eliza finding her voice, Reginald humbled but undaunted, Thomas returning to his ledgers, Arthur seeking a fresh start. The village with its warm community and quiet secrets had weathered the storm. Dolly, she called as her maid appeared at the door. Shall we have another pot of tea? It's a fine morning for it. Dolly grinned. Right away, miss. And maybe a biscuit or two? Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare like a well-tended garden. St. Mary Mead was itself again, its cozy charm restored, its secrets tucked away until the next drama unfolded. As she sat with her tea, her knitting resumed. The soft click of needles a reminder that life, like a good mystery, was a pattern of small moments, carefully stitched together. The curtain had fallen.